Hello guys! Welcome back to Not Just Mecha! It's Marco here, and today we work on Ushoran, more Tarkov Delusion, stripping down the speed painting process to its conceptual and practical beating heart, bare bones and soul. Vampiric puns intended. I don't want to scare you away at the very beginning, especially because from the practical, physical and movements point of view, everything in here is quite simple and straightforward. But I really need to make this disclaimer. The narrative and the explanation of the steps of this project will be linear and in chronological order, to have them matching the visual progression and keep things clean and simple. But the actual planning and definition of the steps are extremely non-linear, and the same goes for some applications that will happen at some point, but will bear fruits later, or way later in the process. So stay with me until the end, and in Memento style, everything will become retrospectively clearer and super logical. I start with a solid coat of black. Every layer of paint, even if quickly applied with the airbrush, translates in a bunch of tiny steps and extra small investments of time that quickly build up into an exponentially bigger pile. Grab the paint, shake the bottle, first load, then clean the airbrush, do the job. So be sure that if I can skip a redundant stage, I'm going to do it. Traditional priming included, jumping directly into a proper color. Here black will represent my slightly visible lowest value from start to finish, and since I'm aiming to a gritty render, through the optical mixing tricks, it will be a good source of desaturation for the next colors that I'm going to overlap in semi-transparency, semi-opacity, so I can accept to keep this step. Coming out from the deepest, darkest shadow of the crypt, less poetically deeper undercuts, armpits, crotch, and all the unmentionable vampiric stuff down there, I step into the more visually interesting chromatic shadow that takes the form of a deep warm purple applied on every element of the piece, because they are all in the same environment. So the environmental shadow should wrap everything in the same way, turning into its purer, unmixed chromatic form in the lower values where it becomes more powerful than the local intrinsic tones, before fading into black. With the major, deepest, common shadows in place, literally only two loose and that simple, general, non-directional applications, I can start working on the mid-values, that in a speed painting process I tend to conveniently, maybe better slyly, merge with the mid-local tones specific of every element of the sculpt, like cape, skin, fur. So the cape, fur, bones and armor escalate into the lower mid-values / mid-tones with an application of warm brown that starts to be more directional and mindful of the vectors of my environmental light, in opposition to my general purple shadow that was more a diffused inside-outside / catch the raised volumes kind of thing, because of its higher, wrapping, foundational uniformity. And a bit of that uniformity is still represented by the use of the same color on several different elements, that, in the simply being all warm tones, can share a big part of their darker modulation. Remember, mid-values and mid-tones are not necessarily the same thing. They are still values and tones, and this will be important later. But in general, for gaming and small scales, we can fuse them together for pure efficiency, adding often also the local color label in this fusion. The exact same idea applies to the skin and to this rich blue, that builds up in the direction of my frontal light, but keeps revealing all the previous layers in the fading of the core application. And to the bright pinkish purple, that I use to suddenly bring the hide and skin flash out of the foundational layers. The mass of fur is the first to enter the midtones, with a progression into an orangey brown that I use also to understand a bit better the volumes of the metallic bits. Metallic paints will benefit a lot from these underpainted temperatures and rich tones, but they will still cover with their higher opacity most of this modeled value information. But, again, this quick and simple detour is useful for me to visualize where to push the light later, and how to define its shape as reflection. So the step stays. I think that the red applied to the cape at this stage is the easiest and most explicit bit, useful to understand and visualize what I mean when I talk about mid-value, mid-color, local tone. This is a red cape, and in the exact middle of lights and shadows, you have its intrinsic, not too dark, not too light, from the factory kind of color. Maybe leaning a bit more into the light values, but this aspect will become more explicit later. Stay with me. The blue then turns into the blue-green territory, as its own, let's call it mid for simplicity. And if you are veterans of the channel and my speed painting shenanigans, or you are simply good at retro-engineering the general scheme from the pictures at the beginning, you are probably starting to see the pattern I'm following, and the end goal I'm chasing with this screeching Tokyo drift around the color wheel. Here, I give a light yellowish beige pass to the voluminous top folds of the fur, officially entering the territories of lights. And then I go back to the skin and its own lights, with a lighter, vibrant green. This is the perfect spot to point out the logic of the timing of these sprayed steps, because through the ripples of space and time, I can hear you screaming at the screen, "Why are you jumping around like that?" That's because using an airbrush, overspray is absolutely inevitable. And this flow internally fixes this problem, optimizing the overlaps that this way correct each other edges with a flow of harmonious and compatible colors, like the orange-brown of the fur before the red of the cape. Or simply a better visual hierarchy, like for example, the importance and sharpness of the skin beats the one of the dirty fur, that can accept a bit of oversprayed green. I also quickly bring the base up to speed, with a progression that jumps from a diffused deep green, this will be incredibly rewarding later, to a dirty greenish grey. And to a super gentle pass of an off-white light blue. That is also useful as an extreme high point of the feral mohawk. And again, the airbrushing logic pushes me in applying the highest tones and values of the cape only after setting up the general structure of the base all around, so I can get the cleanest finish on the cape. That, of course, as the priority. And in case I'm really sloppy, the base can visually handle and thematically accept a bit of light dust. Ooh, and speaking of dust, I chose this light skin tone precisely to start building the idea that the cape is dusty, worn out, and maybe not even made of fabric, but something more sinister. I close the value progression, and in this case I'm being super precise and technical in labeling it as just value, with white ink, that I use mainly to define the bubbles of light of the candles, and a few tiny reflections on protruding elements facing the close lights. In the spirit of fixing all the basic tones, I also quickly lock in place a sketch of the metallic elements. I like to be in full control of my metallic tones and shades, without relying on the bottles I have. So, especially on the foundational levels, I like to mix my own colors, mixing and staining basic neutral silvers with inks that are able to drastically introduce hues without losing the shiny, reflective properties of true metal. And a quick callback to the previous brown-orange stage, the warm base helps make this basic layering of the metals super solid, rich, and also easy to apply in a single pass. Again, I know what you are thinking. Sure, you talked about shadows, mid-values and lights, but here everything is super unbalanced towards the light. Of course, there's a solid reason for this extreme choice. That lies in color theory and in how I like to use oil paints for speed painting. That in the spirit of cutting every possible corner. Here I'm going to use in larger quantities and varieties, and aiming to get from them a higher functional impact than usual. So, to better comprehend all these choices and their interactions from this point on, we need to clarify a foundational concept of painting in general, that we mentioned at the beginning, and that has become the core of my way of painting. The big idea is that values and colors can exist as two separate entities, that even if they will end up merging at the end, procedurally don't really need to happen at the same time or be in sync with each other. My whole sprayed stage has a movement of colors that, as a progression, follows the from dark to light logic and procedural way of painting. Set the black, then the color of the shadows, then the color of the midtones, and so on. But now you can see that my focus was mainly on the tones, and in quickly lock them into the structure of the progression, with a marginal care for their values. Proof of this is that I used only very basic colors straight from the bottle, without any adjustment or any strong value contrast. I just make sure that the final stages are in a clear high value, and almost trespassing into white, because I'm taking in account the practical deformations of the oil stage, and how I use its darkening effect to properly bring back the values into the picture, and in their proper places. These may look like simple washes, and in part they are, because of the sharp definition quickly appearing in the recesses thanks to the low surface tension of the solvent. But what I'm actually applying are very diluted filters and glazes of dark tones to quickly establish the correct values, pushing the previous colors in the correct direction through their merging and overlaps with compatible tones. Blue and green hues for the skin, red and magenta for the cape and leather, and so on. The mixes are more translucent than a classic oil wash, and part of the magic happens because of this selection of mostly transparent and semi-transparent paints. The applications are more gentle and progressive, and there is more back and forth between removing the excess and reapplying paint. Basically 2 or 3 passes for every spot. To optimize this kind of oil-heavy workflow, and my work week in general, I tend to do these first steps in the afternoon, leave the oil layer setting overnight, and then I move back to acrylics in the morning. Great setup and payoff situation. Because of the magic of the green underpainting, when I spray the yellow ink to tint the light, everything becomes vibrant green. But the real magic trick is in the planning of the work. With the application of the last general tone, you can finally see the character of the main light, that came absolute first in the theoretical phase, and last in the practical one. But its polarizing, almost gravitational effect has been present from the beginning, dragging every tone in its direction, and proving again how a good mental image of the virtual environmental light of the scene is essential not as a whimsical storytelling, but as a mandatory, foundational practical bit. This whole process has been designed with a single objective in mind: maximize my enjoyment. And the thing I love the most while painting is noodling textures. You know that I'm super into the convoluted ways of the color wheel and the intricacies of light and volumes, but those are the intellectually engaging parts that, as foundational elements, on the practical side can be quite boring and trivial. So from these I get the lovely dose of flow state I actually crave when painting. Jokes aside, in army and speed painting, I really like this way to separate the details from the core of the work, because at this point the stage remains as a completely independent step that you can freely modulate based only on your personal goals and needs. The values work, the volumes are all readable in a basic form, and there are a bunch of interesting tones and colorful interactions already in place. And for a tiny trooper, or a cheap commission, this can be way more than enough. From here, you can move to the GW style edge highlights as a first step of the evolution of the render, or just have fun and go crazy, adding information until, potentially, you turn the model into a competition piece. And because all that core stuff is already in place, you'll quickly notice from my palette that all the action actually happens between the mid-high values and tones. The oil stage puts everything in its right spot, and with the right proportions. But of course, I lost my extremes in the overlap. Situation pretty similar to the Spanish-style final sprayed smoothing glaze, that in the same fashion tones down the extremes. And this is also a lovely proof of concept for the idea that, for the human eye, this kind of sharp perception of the details happens in a midpoint of the intensity of the light, where it's not blinding and swallowing information in the high extremes, or too weak and swallowing information in the low extremes, aka shadows. To keep things easy to read in the faraway distance of the battlefield, I mainly use a single type of main texture and brushstroke for each area. Shortcuts and nervous thin lines on the cape, stippling on the skin, longer and larger brushstrokes for the stretching and wrinkling of the leather. And to keep the big picture wargaming friendly, these details are visible from every angle with the same intensity and sharpness, to make the 360 view on the field super engaging for both player and opponent. Small extras like these, inspired by the real gaming use of a model, add a ton to the final picture. But for a display figure, for example, I would be way more directional with the framing and the focus of attention and storytelling, to get a better static, clearly main view. And here is the final result. 8 hours of work, as always heavily unbalanced between the super quick initial technical setup and the more relaxed noodling stage. I'll be super honest with you. This is an easy tutorial to follow as it is, but a slightly more complicated one for the extrapolation of ideas, because a similar planning on another model assumes a good comprehension of both values and colors, and all their many potential ways of interacting. But the painters in this community are growing super quickly, and I need to keep up delivering new food for thoughts and aspirational workflows and ideas. So I hope you'll give it a try, and of course, share your experience. If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials, or watch me painting live on Twitch. Check the schedule of the streams on the Twitch homepage. And if you want to support my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!